Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. For those who are the first time here, my name is Zach. I'm 21 years old Russian who left Russia because of the war against Ukraine.
Да.
The video that you have seen a couple of seconds ago is the video of a drone attack on Moscow. Yes, this is the biggest drone attack since the start of the war against Ukraine. And today I'm gonna tell you everything about that attack of drones. There is no clear information about how many drones were involved in this attack, and different resources saying different numbers. For example, the Ministry of Defense of Russia says that 8 drones were involved in the attack in Moscow. 3 of them were shot down with different electromagnetic warfare, and also 5 of them were shot down with a Panzer S missile system. Other Russian sources saying different numbers. For example, at the Baza, they say that at least 25. However, we can verify only 7 of those with all the footage we have on the internet. What kind of drones were used in this attack against Moscow? That's a really good question, because before that, nobody ever saw those drones being in use. So what are those drones? We got different information, none of this verified, but it seems like it's a Ukrainian-made drone and they were launched from the territory of Ukraine. Experts who observed those drones after they were shot down, they've said that the range of those drones is approximately from 400 kilometers up to 1,000 kilometers. And the border with Ukraine is not really far. Like if you look at the closest border of Ukraine to Moscow, it's about 500 kilometers. We also know that the drones have an internal combustion engine, and the wingspan of the drones is not less than 4 meters. The drones were flying on a really low altitude and were not shut down until they got into Moscow. Speaking of navigational system, we're not really sure yet what kind of navigational system were used. Either it was GPS or the global positioning system, the one that is being used by satellites, or it was an internal navigational system, which is not really depend on any kind of satellites or any other resources. But it's not really precise, so people don't really know yet what kind of navigational system was in use in those drones. However, we know that during that attack, the GPS over Moscow was working really bad. For example, here is a video when a taxi driver just cannot really understand where he should go because the GPS doesn't work, doesn't show his location at the moment in the car, because they were just trying to turn off the GPS over Moscow, so it wouldn't be possible to connect those drones to the satellite and to control them from Ukraine with the satellite system. It's funny enough, but Prigozhin, who used to be a head of Russian space agency, Roscosmos, he said that we need to ban GPS. We don't need to use it. Russians need to get back to traditions and to use maps and just to remember the roads. Well, good luck, Prigozhin. Speaking of the navigational system installed in the drones, if they were inertial ones, then it wouldn't be possible to shut down them with electromagnetic warfare. And the Ministry of Defense of Russia claims that they shot down at least 3 of them with electromagnetic warfare. Well, I think those are Ukrainian drones, and there is a guy, Igor Lachenko, who is a Ukrainian journalist and also an activist, and he was fundraising money to start his own line of producing drones. And the 11th of May, in his Telegram channel, he posted a photo with the drones, hugging the drones, and in my opinion, those drones were used in attack against Moscow. Speaking of ammunition, the drones had old Soviet high explosive anti-tank shells, which are KZ-6. Those drones are not really related to the military. Mostly that's an engineer shell, which is being used, for example, to demine things, or for example, to break the walls when you want to collapse a building on some kind of construction. The height of the shell is about 3 kilograms, and in one of the drones, they've seen 3 not detonated shells of KZ-6. Here is the video of one of the drones being shot down and crashing into the ground, and we can see the explosion being activated once landed. And eventually the explosion was pretty heavy, so I think it was really a high explosive anti-tank Soviet shell, which is a KZ-6. What neighborhoods of Russia were attacked? Well, that's a really interesting topic, because as we see, most of the missiles were flying directly to the elite neighborhood of Russia, to the place where Putin and all of his friends, they have houses. And this place is called Rublyovka. Rublyovka is a neighborhood or a county outside of Moscow, on the west of the Moscow, and it's basically all of those small villages which are located and not far from the Rublev highway. And let me tell you what kind of people are actually living in Rublyovka. For example, Gennady Timchenko, who is one of the best friends of Putin and who is the owner of the bank, of the Russian elite bank named Russia. Also, Mikhail Mishustin, who is the prime minister of Russia, the ex-son-in-law of Putin, Kirill Shamalov, he has a house over there. The minister of defense of Russia, Sergei Shoigu, he has a house there. Arkady Rotenberg, who is a friend of Putin from the 90s, he was doing the judo in St. Petersburg with Putin in the same section. Also, Viktor Zolotov, who used to be a previously ex-security guard of Putin, and right now he is the head of federal agency of Rosguardia, which is technically made to fight protesters in Russia. And of course, Igor Sechin, who is a head of Rosneft, one of the biggest oil companies in the world. And of course, Putin himself, he has a residency in Novoogarevo, and actually not far from his residency, about 3 kilometers away, the drone were shut down. Moscow Times, referring to some of the people close to Kremlin, said that Putin was woken up by the Presidential Service of Security and was leaded to the bunker in case there is going to be an attack on Novoogarevo residency, where basically Putin lives for almost all the time. And eventually, yeah, Putin was woken up and he had to run to his bunker again in case there is going to be an attack and he's going to be assassinated this way. So it appeared that Rublyovka, as a neighborhood where all the elite people live, appeared to be the most secured neighborhood, and Moscow itself was not as secure as Rublyovka, even though Rublyovka was more close than Moscow. And yeah, all those other drones that were headed into the center of Moscow, they eventually were not shut down. They just crashed into the buildings. I guess because of the GPS were kind of shut down, and Ukrainians were not able to manage those from the distance. And so they actually crashed into the buildings where people live. But it didn't happen in Rublyovka, just because they have all the means to secure themselves, because they are afraid of it. So 3 of the drones, they were not flying to Rublyovka, but in the center of Moscow, they actually crashed into the 3 houses. The first house located at Leningradsky Prospect Street number 92 and building 1. So eventually one of the windows were broken because of that. It got into the apartment, but didn't detonate it. In the next room, actually, from the room where it got in, there were 3 girls about 18 years old sleeping, and they didn't even woken up when the drone got into the window, because it was about 5 or 6 a.m. and eventually they only woken up and understood that the drone got into the apartment once police were knocking at their door. So the second building was located at the street of Atlasova 11, and eventually it got into a little bit higher than the top window of the whole apartment building. It damaged one of the balconies and one apartment inside, but didn't really do a lot of damage. And another one is crashed into this building, which is located at Profsoyuzna Street number 98 and the building number 6, and only one window is broken. So there is not much of a damage. Only 2 people, they asked for help at the ambulance. What was the reaction of Russian officials? Well, let's start with the press secretary of the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, Dmitry Peskov. And at first, Peskov said that Putin is not going to give any speech to the people because of this drone attack. But later, I think some of the people who work in the government understood that people are angry on the internet, people are furious about it, that nobody would think such a huge attack would be happening in Moscow after more than a year when the war started against Ukraine. And eventually, I think because of that, Putin gave a small interview to one of the medias, and he was saying this.
Выбрал другой путь попыток запугивания России, запугивания граждан России и ударов по жилым зданиям. Это, конечно, явный признак террористической деятельности. Ну, во-первых, хочу сказать, что система ПВО Москвы сработала штатно, удовлетворительно, хотя есть над чем работать.
Later, Putin was also saying that Ukraine was trying to provoke Russia to bomb Kyiv with drones like they did to Moscow. But Putin never mentioned that before that attack on Moscow, 29th of May, so one day before the attack on Moscow, Russia, Putin himself, they launched a drone attack on Kyiv. And they launched not like 7 drones like Ukraine, not 8 drones or whatever number media say. Russia launched at least 31 drones, and 20 of those were luckily shot down by Ukrainian anti-missile systems. However, 2 of them actually hit the target, and eventually 1 person died and 3 were injured. But Putin never gonna mention that. Of course, Prigozhin has to command every single event happening in Russia, and eventually he was speaking really fiercely against the Ministry of Defense of them not doing anything.
Какого хуя вы допускаете прилета этих беспилотников в Москву? То, что они на Рублевку летят к вам домой. Да и хрен-то с ним, пускай ваши дома полыхают. А что людям обычным делать, когда в их окна врезаются беспилотники со взрывчатым веществом?
But it's funny that Prigozhin is trying to build that picture as a real patriot of Russia, and he tries to get this popularity among Russian people, not among high-level society, but among the average class, the middle class, and lower class. So he's saying, I don't really care if your house is gonna be on fire in Rublyovka. So he's saying this to all of those friends of Putin, all of those oligarchs, all of the people in the government. He says, I don't really care if they're gonna be on fire. But what do we as a ordinary people, yeah, of course Prigozhin is a really ordinary person, what are we going to do when we are gonna be under attack? You should be the one who should protect us. And yeah, Prigozhin is trying to play, of course, to get extra popularity among other people who are not really happy with the Ministry of Defense of Russia. And of course, the biggest propagandist of Russia, aka Russian Goebbels, Vladimir Solovyev, he felt like he needs to answer to Prigozhin.
Ах, Рублевка, а там не русские люди живут? Не наши с вами соотечественники? Ах, Москва, а что, все москвичи на смузи фалафельный? Чего вы так радуетесь? Вот так чуть-чуть свое эго, что не стали звездами, в жопу себе засуньте.
It's kind of weird, but the head of the Russian volunteer corps, Denis Kapustin, the one who was participating in this Belgorod operation when they kind of invaded the territory of Belgorod Oblast, which is a Russian territory basically, he said that he supports the words of Prigozhin, that the Ministry of Defense does nothing. And he says that Prigozhin, as myself, as Denis Kapustin said, he's also a real patriot of Russia like myself, even though we are fighting for different sides. That's a really interesting words. I don't really think anyone would agree with Prigozhin on anything, but Denis Kapustin felt like he needs to say that. And eventually he said that me as a Moscovite in 2 generations, I'm really sad that people in Moscow wake up because of those explosions, and the war is fear and it's a nightmare. That's what he said. However, you would think he says like, yeah, it's bad, but at the same time, he did the same with his Russian volunteer corps in Belgorod Oblast. It's basically the same. They got into the village, also kind of threatened the locals. I mean, not really threatened, but of course, they've heard the fighting locals. They were really afraid of that. So he's saying like it's bad, but he did the same, but in different locations. What was the reaction of Ukraine to this drone attack? Well, Mikhail Podolyak, who is the advisor to the head of the office of the president of Ukraine, Podolyak said that Ukraine has nothing to do with this drone attack. However, in my opinion, he's lying. And why do I think so? Because, well, he says that they only can attack the targets which are located in the occupied territories, which are, by his words, Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics and also Crimea. So he says we do not attack anything outside of those territories. But we can prove he is wrong by so many cases of attacks on oil refinery, for example, in Krasnodar Krai, or on the shilling of the city in Belgorod Oblast named Shebekina. So basically, it's obvious that Ukrainians attack targets inside of Russia. And I'm not saying those are not legitimate targets, but I understand that the Ukrainian government, they cannot take all the responsibility for that, because it's going to be a bad sign for the Western partners, and it's going to show like, yeah, we can use your weapons to actually attack inside of Russia, and Western partners are going to be just asking why. That's really interesting, but the mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, he said on the 29th of May in the interview after one of the drone attacks in Kiev, which are happening so often in the last couple of weeks, he said, referring to Zaluzhny, who is the head of commander of the armed forces of Ukraine, he said this.
Якщо столицю України вони, росіяни, можуть так звано, таким словом можна назвати, кошмарити, я переконаний, що чому мешканці Москви відпочивають в столиці Росії.
And it's interesting enough that he gave that interview during the day on the 29th of May, and eventually already in the morning, in like 6 a.m., 30th of May, there was the biggest drone attack on Moscow since the start of the war. So I guess it kind of says something. He actually said on the next day, 30th of May, somebody from the journalists, they asked, like, how did you know? Is it like a coincidence that you said about the drone attack on Moscow, and eventually the next day it happened? And he said, kind of referring to one of the jokes about him, he said that, well, it seems like I really can look inside the future. What were the reactions of Western countries on this attack on Moscow? For example, the American White House press secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, she said that we don't support attacks inside of Russia. At the same time, British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly said, Ukraine does have the legitimate right to defend itself. It has a legitimate right to do so within its own borders, of course, but it also does have the right to project force beyond its borders to undermine Russia's ability to project force into Ukraine itself. And the main question of this whole video is why? Why was this attack just made? Just why? What kind of military purpose to deoccupy Ukraine it had? So let's kind of think about this. Firstly, I think the main damage was made to the elites of Russia, because most of the drones were actually headed inside of Rublyovka. And people who used to be the friends of Putin, who used to be the bases of Putin's regime, they are being attacked right now. Some of them are not being even hit by the sanctions, but now they're going to be hit by the rockets, by the drones. So the war came to their home. And right now they're going to think about either Putin is a, let's say, powerful leader, or maybe they should even stop the war. Maybe they should make Putin stop the war somehow. So it has this psychological and really painful effect on the elites of Russia, which is really important. This drone attack also shows to the average Russians who live between the border with Ukraine and between Moscow that they could be easily attacked and nothing would protect them. All this military that was promoting itself for all of those 20 years, all the money they've spent on the defense of Russia are being basically corrupted, stolen. So it shows, especially to those people, that they could be the targets and easily being attacked, and nothing would stop them. So Russia is turning into something like, yeah, protect yourself. We don't really care, unless it's Moscow, unless it's especially Rublyovka, the neighborhood for the friends of Putin, for the besties of Putin. From the military point of view, I can see that it can kind of help to the Ukrainian potential counteroffensive, because Russia would need to move some of those Panzer or C-400, C-300 anti-aircraft systems into the direction of Moscow, into the border between Ukraine, to, or even closer to Moscow, to protect it so people wouldn't be angry about it. And eventually it will lose the potential on the Donetsk direction, where most of the Russian army is located right now. So eventually they will have less anti-air missile systems or anti-missile systems over there to protect the bases with the equipment, with ammunition, with food, with oil. Because of this drone attack, Russian Ministry of Defense would need to spread out the whole anti-aircraft warfare to the border with Ukraine, and especially to the Belgrade direction, from where it can fly to Moscow. And it means that the Donetsk direction, the army in Donetsk, is going to be less protected. Financial Times said that the goal of such operations is to fool your enemy, to make the situation of uncertainty, and to disperse the resources of the Russian military. And of course, that's important before the counteroffensive. So I think this drone attack, it was more of an informational attack, mostly to put the chaos inside the Russian society and to make some of the Russians to actually start to care about politics and not being apolitical, as I guess most of the people in Moscow. So, and also, of course, to disperse the resources of Russian military before the upcoming counteroffensive operation. So that's about it, this whole drone attack. I think it's going to have a really big effect. That's why I decided to make this video. As usual, it was me, Zach the Russian. Thank you so much for everyone who support me on Patreon and support me during my live streams. As usual, support Ukraine, support Ukrainian military, and I hope there's going to be peace in Ukraine and freedom in Russia. And also don't forget to follow my news channel on Telegram, which is called Russia Tomorrow. The link is going to be in the description below.